Assalamu alaikum. My name is Firas Hamdan. I was born and raised in Massachusetts. My mother is a Southern Baptist Protestant Christian, also born and raised in Massachusetts. My father is Lebanese, from the South. He's Shia Muslim. I grew up mostly around my mother. I grew up Christian, going to church on Sundays, celebrating Christmas, Easter, all of these things. The area that I grew up in is mostly, Anglo-Saxon, white American Christian. Was not a very diverse area. I think the nearest mosque was about an hour and a half away. Halal meat is also an hour and a half away. Anything pretty much like Islamic or ethnic or anything is very far. So you can imagine like the area and, what I had to grow up around. But for the most part, everything I've known my whole life until I was about 13, 14 years old was typical American. I ate pork, I did all those things. I didn't know it was wrong. My father, he's, Muslim, but wasn't, as practicing as he could have been. So for the most part, my knowledge about Islam was pretty much, all I knew was you don't drink and, they believe that there's one God and Muhammad is their prophet. Other than that, I had not much more knowledge about Islam. So you could say for the most part I was raised as a typical white American, not knowing much about being Arab or being Muslim. All my life I did have this sense of belonging to a higher power. I always believed that there was a God. Even while I was going to church and while I was, I guess you could say Christian, I always had this uncertainty of, when I was practicing Christianity because of the, Holy Trinity, Jesus, the Son of God, all of these things. I was just told to believe it. My mom would always tell me about it, and everybody I grew up around, it was a very common thing. But all I knew is that, from a young age, I always knew that, there had to have been a God, and that he'd have to have at least, a universal message for everybody to live by. And I wasn't, obviously, as a young kid, I wasn't exactly sure of what that was. I had a lot of questions, that arose during, when I was young, going to church and stuff like that. But I didn't have anybody that would satisfy those answers. My mother, she was a very devout Christian, and she still is. But she's by no means a scholar, obviously. So, I definitely always had this, belief in a God, my whole life. I first heard about Islam when I was, around, I'd say 11 or 12 years old. This was during the time when, 9/11 happened. The reason I heard about it obviously is because during school time, everyone's talking about it, all this, Muslims are terrorists and stuff like that. And, when I was growing up, kids, they didn't know that I was, Arab. They just thought, I had a weird name. They just thought okay, he's got dark hair, dark eyes. He could be Italian or Mexican or something. They didn't know what I was. So, but they did know that my dad was foreign or something. And I guess somewhere along the lines, they found out that my father is Muslim. And they used to say a lot of things oh, your father is the reason for this, his people, et cetera, et cetera. And I was 11, 12 years old at this time, and I didn't know how to defend my own father because I didn't know much about Islam. I knew not even the bare essentials of Islam. Very few things. So, I was actually afraid because I was is this what my dad, what my relatives are like, da da da. I was it can't be true. So I used to, I'd go to my dad, I ask him some questions. My dad, he just gave me very broad, basic questions. I kept asking him very specific things. And again, he wasn't able to really answer a lot of the questions I had. So I had really no other choice than to go to the library, to go online. I searched anything I could, all these lecturers on YouTube. And, that's basically when I started researching into Islam, and, once I watched one video, it got me hungrier for another one and another one and another one. And, it came to a point where my father, he actually caught me at nighttime, at like 2, 3 in the morning on a school night. And I was downstairs, and back then we only had one computer in our house, and I was on that at like 3, 4 in the morning just watching lectures of, Ahmed Didat debating Christians, like, about how Jesus doesn't say in the Bible that I'm the Son of God and any of this stuff. So I would say from like 12 years old, that's when I started like researching. And it took me about, I'd say 2, 3 years of, watching lectures and reading so many books to finally convert to Islam. And at that point, it took a lot out of me. It was very hard for me to let go of that belief that Jesus is the Son of God, because ever since I was a kid, that's all I've ever been taught. If you don't accept him, you're going to go to hell because of this. And it wasn't like a very quick thing. It wasn't like, like I heard one verse and I was like, that's it. Or I heard one thing and that was it. It took a lot of convincing, because obviously I had my own bias. I heard many things about what Islam says, this and that, and I had to satisfy it. So it was around like 12 years old, I'd say. That's when I started. The need to search and to figure out what exactly Islam was, I think it was more of like a way of trying to justify, like, my father is a good person, because, a lot of people at that time were saying, this and that about Islam, terrorists, they abuse women, they're chauvinistic, all kinds of stuff like this. So, and I know my father is not like that, obviously. So I just wanted to kind of like, feel good about myself and know that that's not the case. But what I found was much more. I found truth in it. I found things that made much more sense than what I was already believing, going to church and stuff like that. They brought up a lot of questions that I couldn't argue, and it basically just opened my mind. I always wondered why, we're supposed to be a monotheistic religion, Christianity, yet we have 3 gods. You can pray to God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. I never really understood how is that, one God. That's one of the things that really attracted to me, Islam. Islam, it's very simple. One God, one prophet, and that's really what attracted me the most to it. At that time, because, I had no, friends, no relatives, no Muslim contacts at all. When I went online, most of what I seen, most of the websites I found, lecturers I found, were Sunni websites or Sunni speakers. So at that time, that's what I believed in, and for the most part, I was more concerned with the oneness of God. I wasn't really going into, the history so much about Islam. I was mostly concerned with, what do they say about God? What is God like? Does God look like a person? Does he have blonde hair and blue eyes? Can you see what God looks like? All of these things. Those, I think, were the points that I really looked for. The books I looked for were about that. The lectures I looked for were about this kind of thing. So I would say for about, from 12, 13 years old until 18, that whole time, I was a practicing Sunni Muslim. I looked up online how to pray like a Sunni. All of these things, I practiced exactly like a Sunni. So during the period between I was 12 to 18 years old, this whole time, I was very serious. At that time, I went to school, I played sports and stuff like that. I was the only Arab/Muslim in my entire school. From elementary school to middle school all the way to high school. Never had Muslim or Arabs as classmates. I was the only one. And, in a way, I kind of liked it. I was very, very serious, and I wanted to be a good example for everybody else, and I was not afraid of being different. I remember my junior year in high school, I decided I'd wear, like the skull cap. I think they call it a kufi. I wore it to school every single day. I wanted people, I wanted people to come up and ask me, why do you wear this? Why are you, like this? Why don't you eat pork and stuff like that? Of course, during that time, I was still eating, haram meat, and all that other stuff, but they don't know, they didn't know that what I was doing was wrong. But yeah, I kind of wanted to attract this attention. And I think that's, in the beginning, that's what I really liked about Sunni Islam, because they do, they have a lot of da'wah, videos and stuff like that. They go out to non-Muslims very much, and they're very active. And that's kind of how I was. I was very, out there. I was, debating people a lot in school, Christians, Jews, I was very into that, especially with Christians. I always, anytime, there was people talking about politics or religion, I wanted to be the first one in there and say my 2 words, But, when I was 18 years old, a senior in high school, my father, it's not like my father didn't see all this. He noticed, he's like, oh, my son, he's a Salafi, he's praying like this, he's saying everything is like bid'ah, and, my dad had a conversation with me. He's like, why are you Sunni or whatever, he started saying a lot of things. He's like, they did this and they did that or whatever. I wouldn't take anything my dad would say seriously because, at the beginning, when I started researching Islam, I kind of established that my dad is not like a valid resource of what, religion is. So, I would argue with him about these things, and I would, beat him with the Sunni argument against my dad who's Shia, So, I said to myself, I was like, okay, I was turned off already by, Shiism. I seen a lot of things online, pictures, stuff like that. I would be in a lot of chat rooms and stuff online saying that Shia, they hate the, companions, they hate all of these things, hate, all these. So I was just wondering, what made them hate these people so much, or do they hate these people so much? All of these questions kind of arose. So I was like, I owe it to my dad, why don't I just check into this, see what it's like. So, I started trying to find Sunni Shia, debates online. And mostly what I just kept finding was Sunnis talking about Shiism. I never really found a lot of lecturers of Shiism, Shia lecturers talking about Shia Islam. So I kept getting a lot of these people saying, that they, during Ashura, they turn off the lights and they commit adultery with each other. They, believe that, Ali is above the Prophet. They worship the Imams, all of these things. So I was like, what, when I was going to church, people would say a lot of things about Islam. So I was like, okay, this sounds a lot like what I was told about Muslims before I became Muslim. So let me look into it a little bit more. So, I started listening to some lectures. I found a few. I found Hajj Hassanin Rajabali, I found Sayyid Ammar Nakshawani, I found a few others too. And, they started talking about the history a little bit more, and I realized I didn't know too much about the history. I just know more about the theology, just basically beliefs in God and stuff like that. So when I started looking into the history, Imam Hussein came up. That was the biggest thing for me when I decided to lean more towards the Shia school of thought. I never heard about the martyrdom of Imam Hussein before that. Some of the hadiths and stuff like that I heard when I was listening to Sunni lectures, most of it was when Hassan and Hussein were little kids. Very little things about them. Almost nothing. I knew Imam Hussein was killed, but I didn't know it was a massacre or anything like that. I was not taught that. So the first thing that I seen about Imam Hussein when I heard about the massacre, that made me really doubt everything that I ever learned. When all these books that I read, all the lectures I heard. I used to listen to Khalid Yassin. I used to listen to Hamza Yusuf, Ahmed Didat, Yusuf Estes, all these guys, all these Sunni lecturers. Never once did I hear anything about Imam Hussein and Karbala and how he was sacrificed. So once I heard about that made me dive into the world of Shiism. So when I first decided